If you'd like to know what this is in my hand, then stick around till the end of the video. And be sure to go past the point where I say goodbye, because that's when this comes into play. Hi everyone and welcome. We're in my wormery, and I've got a couple tubs behind me. They're the ones that have no label on them. And you might have something like this in your wormery as well. It's what I refer to as my finishing tubs. So when one of my worm bins gets to the point where I feel like the material is almost finished, I'll extract the majority of the worms, relocate them into a fresh environment, and then I'll take that material and I'll set it aside just to sit for the most part. And after a certain period of time, I'll start treating it as if it had been loaded with worm cocoons, worm eggs, and it probably is loaded with worm eggs and worm cocoons. And then I just allow enough time for any of those cocoons to hatch out, and then I attempt to try to bait the worms out of the material. This way I feel like I'm putting a good effort into retaining as many worms as possible within my wormery. And then I also feel like I'm not taking compost that's loaded with worms and dumping it out into the garden. Although, there's really nothing wrong with that. If you were to take a bunch of compost full of worm eggs and place it into your garden, and in the end end up with a bunch of worms crawling around in your garden, in your soil is only better for it. But I typically like to follow this practice. I don't always do it. Sometimes I harvest the castings, and however it comes out of the recently retired worm bin, I just use the material as is. But since I was already done planting my garden, using all the vermicompost I had in storage, I'm just using this as a little bit of a baiting test. I've tried baiting worms in the past using different methods, and in these two bins I'm in the process of attempting to extract worms that may have just recently hatched. So my expectation is that the majority of the worms in these bins are tiny little baby worms, recently hatched, and hopefully attracted to the bait that I had placed in there. So today's mission is going to be to extract the two bait bombs that I refer to as little containers that have food in them, so that whatever worms have been collected can be placed into one of my newer active bins, and also at the same time evaluate the material to see if it's required to continue baiting to try to lure more worms out of the material, or am I satisfied with the fact that at this point it's probably just a container full of castings only, and that I could take it out of my bin and put it into storage, throw it into a bucket, and then get that bin back into service composting. So all I'm going to be doing here today is pulling the bait bombs out of these two tubs, moving the worms out, and if need be reloading the bait bombs, putting them back up on the shelf. But in the case of the older of the two bins, the one right behind me here on the end, it's 50 days old. And after 50 days, that should be ample time for any cocoons to have hatched out. I believe about half that time is the normal estimated time for a cocoon to hatch. So we've given this bin plenty of time for any cocoons to hatch out, for the worms to crawl out, make their way over to the bait bombs. So my hope is that at the end of the day, I'm going to be able to just dump the castings out of this container and reclaim the tub for ongoing use. The other one, it's only been in action this way for about half that time. So in that case, I could see reloading the bait bomb, giving it a little bit more time. But I guess we'll really see when we get them up onto the bench. So I'm going to get these tubs out here. We'll get the worms out, and then we'll release them too. But I think in terms of reloading the bait bombs and any other cleanup or moving of the compost into a bucket, all that boring stuff, we'll skip that. We'll just try to focus on the activities where we might have some worm spotting. So let's get to work. So any worms that we extract, we'll just place them temporarily into this little tub and release them at the end. But this first stage is really going to be mainly about extraction and then release. And then the stuff that I'll save for later off camera is just the reloading of the bait bombs if necessary, unloading of a tub of finished compost if we deem that that's the state of this tub in the end, and cleanup. But right now the mission at hand is to get worms out. So any worms that I spot along the way, I'm not letting them squirm back down into the into the finished compost. My aim is going to be to get them out of here, collecting moisture there. For some reason I felt like we were getting very close to the finish line with this tub, so I'm just going now on my gut instinct in terms of where we were last time we checked in, but frankly I just don't remember exactly. First thing to happen in most cases when I'm doing this is to take a quick peek down into the hole. Since if there are any worms within this little baiting box, then they'll stay there, but any ones that might just be here on the very perimeter of the hole might be repelled by the light and the activity, so I try to capture them really quickly before they can squirm out of view. But so far, checking through this material, I have not seen... Oh, spoke too soon. I found two. And that reminds me, this container only has holes on two of its sides, two opposite sides. So that means a couple of the sides probably wouldn't have that smell of food, so probably wouldn't have as many worms as you would on two of the other sides that are facing the openings in the container. So I think since that side, yeah, I think that's where the holes were. Since that's where we saw worms on that side, I'm assuming the side closer to me is also possibly going to have worms too. Even though we didn't spot them first go around, we can poke around a little bit more through that material we pulled out of that side. Here again, we're definitely not finding many, which is a terrific sign. It's really what we're after here, right? The material looks really nice too. A lot of people might follow this sort of a step with a final step of screening. And when you do the screening, what you're after at that point, I guess, is ultimately a really, really fine material, small enough to fit through a small sieve, and excluding any sort of stuff like this, which would just be a piece of cardboard paper or whatever that just never made it through the composting process. It was just some of the bedding that was part of the container. And then, you know, you've got yourself a really, really nice stash of beautiful compost material. But I usually, I usually don't strive for that degree of perfection with my compost. I'm pretty satisfied with this just the way it is. And in storage, that stuff should dry out pretty good. You'll end up with a bucket full of pretty evenly distributed moisture throughout your compost. It's just right now, since there was feedings going on down the middle, and since the plastic was covering the middle of the tub, the outer edges over here had a better chance to dry out and get closer to that ideal consistency that you're after. Not quite as clumpy, more prone to crumble apart. But even before I would want to run this stuff through a sieve, I'd prefer to see stuff that's remaining this damp to dry out enough where it can easily crumble just by being touched. So you don't have to, you know, crumble little chunks yourself by hand while you're sifting. The idea would be that you just throw the stuff in a sifter. The few things that get caught remain, everything else passes through, and it's fairly quick. But this stuff ain't going to get sifted. I'm not going to take the time to bother with that. I think this stuff is perfect just the way it is. I'm dubbing it as complete. We'll just take another quick look on this edge to make sure we're seeing consistent results throughout. And I believe I am. All really nice stuff. I like doing this. I like spreading the moisture around. You find pockets of dry areas, and then you mix it around with some stuff so they can share the moisture, you know, and even out. Anything that's too damp gives its dampness over to something that might be getting too dry. Anything that's too dry would end up ultimately just being too stiff. The stuff, when it dries out, becomes like concrete, so you don't want that, that's for sure. All right, let's get these worms out of this bait box. Here again, I'm just assuming we're going to find worms, hoping we're going to find worms, but seems like a realistic expectation since this is where the food has been. I believe I only see one worm down in there, all the way at the very, very bottom. So we got to, yeah, we'll try to get him out. Let's get a stick. I try to do this gently when I have to do this. I don't want to be injuring any worms in the process of trying to relocate them. So I think this is our last holdout. We'll bring him over to the tub, let him join all of his friends and neighbors. Just going to take one last look in here. I think we're good. So I've got to admit, that was a pretty clean cut. That was just 1, 2, 3. We pulled the bait out. The material looks like it's done, and it looks like a 50-day turnaround is a pretty good expectation for a quantity this size. And there again, I'm going by red wigglers. I believe red wigglers hatch from their cocoons in a time frame of somewhere between 21 and 24 days. You know, so since this bin, being 50 days old, is now had twice that much time. So it's pretty safe to assume that any cocoons that were in here have since hatched. You know what the funny thing is? The contents of this bait bomb, yeah, okay, there we go. Three baby worms. 3 fairly small juvenile sized worms. There's a couple more, okay. There's a whole bunch of grit that we gave them too. Definitely not a huge number of worms, you know? I was sort of expecting more, although maybe, you know, maybe we extracted them in previous efforts like this. I believe the last time I was in here was a week ago, so even at that point it was well beyond the time frame needed for any eggs deposited into the material to hatch out. So maybe at that point we had already successfully lured out the majority of the worms from the material and collected them and moved them already. So either way, let's get these little guys aside. I'm going to try to keep an eye on them. That's weird too. I guess a little helper from the bin, a little beetle or something is hanging out down there. I'm usually not terribly put off by finding the helper creatures that are in my bins. In the beginning I always thought to myself that, you know, oh my goodness, any sort of foreign creature in my bin doesn't belong there, panic time, blah blah blah. But more recently I've come to appreciate the fact that the worms do only a portion of the breaking down of the material, and all the other occupants in the bin, including microscopic life forms that you can't even see, are responsible for just as much, if maybe not even more. So it's hard to say. All right, I think here we're not covering back up. We're not reloading the bait bomb. We're just going to set this aside, and at some point later I'll empty it. But let's see how we did on the other tub. Lately I've been getting a lot of flying insects. And I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe it's not a lot. I guess the ideal number would be none. It's the fact that there are any. It's down to your tolerance for it. And I think I've just always tolerated them. Once in a while, whether it's mites or flying insects, once in a while I experience a little bit of a surge in population of this type of pest or that type of pest. And I think usually the first best thing to do is to maybe stop thinking them as being pests. It takes the heat off, that's for sure. Try to look at the positive spin as to how they can be helping you while they're in your bin. But heck, some of them are just there to mooch off some of the food that's meant for the worms, and they don't really provide any sort of benefit for the bin, then I don't really see them as welcome guests. So I think we'll do the same thing here. We'll try to take note of where the holes are. These will be the two sides for us to check when we pull out the bait bomb. We'll set it aside though. As soon as we pull it out, we'll set it aside so we can do that rapid excavation of the surrounding areas to see if we can snag any worms before they dig themselves deep into the vermicompost. So let's start with that. Hopefully anybody that's on or near the box will just go into or remain in the box. What do we got here? People that are just on their way into the restaurant or just on their way out. More likely on their way in. Tiny, tiny ones. I guess that was what we were expecting, right? There's going to be a lot of tiny ones, if any. I'm starting to encounter a number of them. These are a little bit larger. Definitely a mix of worms that, you know, slid through the process of me harvesting this material, which I allow quite a few through since I'm not overly thorough. I try to migrate as many of them out as I can. The ones that don't get out in that wave will ultimately get accounted for here or somewhere else along the way. But I've usually got multiple passes through trying to get the population out of the container, so I don't sweat it too much when I don't feel like I've reached 100% or close to that. Got a pretty loose tolerance for my depopulation efforts. You can go crazy with this stuff. You can be in here for days, hours at least, to pick out worms one at a time this way. So I gotta kind of stop myself. I gotta rein myself in to say, hey, this is the bin that's only had 2 weeks, 3 weeks to hatch out these baby worms, and that's what I'm seeing. I don't know if you could see them as I'm picking them out, but they are itsy bitsy little worms. So one thing we know for sure is that this bomb is going to get reloaded, so we can continue this process the way it's working, which it's working well. I think it's doing pretty good. At least you get a chance to kind of inspect things close up. Give yourself a time limit or some sort of a limit to force yourself to stop at some point. But it's so cool picking out all these little itsy bitsy tiny worms. Picking out a few, you know, mature ones too, but a lot of these are just so tiny. So it's certainly not going to be a big haul out today. I mean, we might have a pretty good haul out, but we should also expect that there's going to be a fair number of additional worms working their way out of this material over to the baiting area. So I do not want to go too crazy here. Once again, I've dislodged some more and more damp material, found a number of mature sized worms, not surprisingly. We'll take a few more passes through here, a couple more combs, fetch out another couple handfuls of volunteers, and I gotta go fetch some food to put back into the bomb. We'll get this bait bomb going again and continue this process. It seems like it's working well. Like I said, placing food into this thing and backfilling the hole, getting it covered up, all boring stuff. Why don't we just proceed to the releasing of the worms we collected, and then we'll call that a day. I'll take care of the rest off camera. Can't resist. Saw this one guy, he just had to go. All right, onward. Okay, as it has been for a while now, any worms that we managed to collect out of our finishing tubs, we've been releasing into the newest of my bins. The two other bins that I have that are slightly older than this one have so many more worms. So this is also the bin that is a little bit more shy on population size. So for those two reasons, I'm using this as the place to put our collected worms. Nobody on the plastic, that's good. I'm already seeing a lot of them coming up here to take advantage of the collecting moisture that condenses. See a worm cocoon right there, as well as right there. Let's see if we can get the camera in a little bit closer. It's the only two I see so far, but they're probably everywhere. Kind of light in color. This one's a little darker. Ooh, feisty. Whatever. Sorry, buddy. Let's remove this plastic here as well. Any other hitchhikers? We'll just leave those two cocoons on there. They're not bothering anyone. I just always worry about a worm squirming off the plastic and finding itself someplace where it doesn't want to be, in a dry place where it ends up meeting its demise. I guess that's what's happening here too. These little guys are getting all squirmy, getting away from the nice damp pile of food stuff and realizing, hey man, it's kind of dry out here. We don't like this. Let's go get back into the moist. It's retreating from the escape attempt. So I don't think we're going to have much of an exciting release here. Almost seems like it's a shame to bother these little guys on top of the piece of paper here to do this. But it's also kind of a cool opportunity to see how things are going in this bin. This bin is a little bit different. I've been attempting to manage this and the other two bins that are nearest in age to this as sort of equivalent setups that we can sort of compare and contrast the results on against one another. But this bin has now also not only been my newest bin, it has suddenly become the place where I had extracted food that I had placed in here. I've got other bins that I'm trying to drive towards the finish line. So any sort of really slow composting items from those bins, like a mango seed, something that does take quite some time to break down, I extracted it from that bin to help that bin make its way to the finish line more quickly. So this bin will receive an injection of a few new worms coming in, mostly baby worms, I think. But it's also given me a chance to see if it's going to be time to feed this bin, because the other two bins, like I said, I've been trying to manage them similarly, so I've been trying to feed them on the same day and, you know, maintain the same period of time between feedings and whatnot. But this bin has now, I think, for numerous reasons, stepped out of that pattern, that feeding pattern, and will definitely not be needing any food next time I come down here to feed those other two bin that I've been trying to keep this third bin in sync with. But that's fine. It doesn't matter where their food comes from and when, or whether or not it's hitting my schedule. I just have this theory that it might be beneficial sometimes to have multiple bins running concurrent with each other, very similar in setup, so that if any one of them should go haywire, you can at least see that your methods in the other two bins are consistently working okay, and that bin has something unique going on with it. Or it could also be a warning sign that something's going to happen to the other two bins where it's not manifested itself yet. So kind of an early warning system. So I don't know, it's just a kind of a interesting way to have a control, like a common control setup. They're all being handled the same way, and if one of them deviates, then might help troubleshoot. I don't know. All right. Oh, gotta remind myself I'm not feeding, right? Here I am, like clearing a space for the next feeding, and that's not why we're here, right? We're here to let loose the baby worms, but I think I also did want to determine whether there's going to be more food needed. Sometimes I feel bad leaving the bins with only a handful of really slow composting tough items like this, pumpkin stems and mango seeds. Those things take forever. I like to include a little bit more easy to eat stuff for them once in a while too. So we'll see. Maybe I'll just give them a small amount of food when we get around to feeding the other bins, the other red wiggler bins. So here's our collected population. This is our only chance to see how many of them we got. A lot of them are probably buried into the material, but I wouldn't say more than a few dozen. Doesn't seem like many. Here we go, more food too. If there were a lot of worms, then they would have eaten the majority of the food in the bait bombs, but you know, not that many. I guess that's another indicator too. If the food that you're putting in the bait bomb gets depleted quickly, then you might even have worms that came to eat and have already left too. But in this case, I think we did a pretty good job collecting some worms so we can move them over. I will be reloading the younger of the two finishing tubs that we worked on today, but the older one, the 50-day one, is, in my mind, just a tub full of finished castings. So those castings will be placed into a bucket that I'm careful not to seal, because if it does seal, then then the material in there can get really funky, and any worms that might still be in there will die, and it'll stink to high heaven. Trust me, I speak from experience. Don't do it. Let's also kind of follow our tradition here of trying to keep the baiting area, or the feeding area in the case of this bin, covered with a nice haven of different types of bedding materials that they can enjoy. I'm just restoring this paper to top off the feeding. Maybe we can even use a little bit of paper to top off the food that came along with the migration of the collected worms that we baited. All right, cool. Like what I'm seeing here. So let's see if I can get everything put away here without making too big of a mess. So I'll take care of the rest of this. I won't bore you with the remainder of the put away and the cleanup. But before I go, let me just say thank you. Thanks for watching the video. I really appreciate your company, and if you enjoyed the video, I hope you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. I really appreciate that, and you might also consider subscribing to the channel. That's appreciated too. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now. I'm sure there are plenty of you out there who know exactly what this is. Oh, I must be really losing it, because the finishing tasks here would have been to, if you remember, after the camera gets turned off, for me to come back in here to reload this, put it back in place, and let it get back to work. However, when I came in here to take care of that, you can already see, we never even removed the worms. Gosh, I'm losing it. So really quick, just so I can get this thing put into the place of the worms and get the bait box back into service, let's just do a really quick extraction, see what we collected in this bin. Okay, I don't see any worms hanging on the outside of it, but then again, they've had fair time to retreat out of the light. So let's see what we end up with here. I'll fish those guys out later. Let's see who's occupying the food, the bait. In this bin, I think we've got far more worms. I believe I took a much less thorough approach when I was harvesting the material. I pulled out a lot of worms when I harvested the material, but I believe I also left a great deal more behind in this batch that I have set out for finishing, that we're still baiting worms from at this point, or we will be once we reload this thing. So I'll watch these little guys squirm away. You can see there's a number of fairly small worms hanging out in here. Very little tiny worms. Even smaller there. I don't want to go crazy looking for them. Guess you peel apart some of this gooey food material soaked in between a couple things. You even find more. I bet we can extract even more, but I'm just going to let these little guys get settled in, and then we'll be that much closer to being done. I could deploy this bait bomb with the food that I bought down here. Well, you know what? Geez, that was pretty quick. I look at the bait bomb for 2 seconds, then I look back down. It looks like the majority of these little guys have already retreated into the material. Alright, well, I'll fish these last couple worms out. Not too many. Half a dozen or so. Get this thing reloaded, but that's boring. Nothing to see there. Alright, this time for real. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.